We are live.
Hello, welcome to another edition of Socialist Action webcast. My name is Elizabeth Weiss, and I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, a past Secretary of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and of course, a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. I'm speaking to you from Newfoundland and Labrador. That includes the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and Micmac on the island of Newfoundland, and the Inuit and Innu, the original people of Labrador. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is economics after COVID, the need for national reconstruction planning, with Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Centre for Future Work in Vancouver, BC, and Sydney, Australia. And then we have discussing Florence Shade, a leading member of Socialist Action based in Wet'suwet'en territory. Jim will speak for about 25 minutes, followed by Flo for up to 10 minutes. After that, we will take questions written into the chat column from the online audience. So let's begin. Jim Stanford is a Canadian economist and founder of the Progressive Economic Forum. He holds a master's degree in economics from Cambridge University and a doctorate from the New School for Social Research. He writes a column for the Globe and Mail. In 2016, Stanford relocated to Australia, where he is the founding director of the Centre for Future Work, a left-wing research organization funded by the public policy think tank, the Australian Institute. He is also a regular contributor on economics to Huffington Post Australian. So welcome, Jim.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. And thank you very much to Socialist Action for organizing this session and inviting me to converse with you. I am coming to you from Vancouver, and I do want to acknowledge that I'm on unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples here, and pay my respects to them, and also commit to fighting for justice for First Nations. Interesting time that we've been through in the last year and a half. Obviously, an unprecedented shock to public health, first and foremost, with the COVID pandemic, but also to the way our economy has been operating. And it's posed some incredible challenges, but it's also, in a way, created some incredible opportunities. And if you look at history, you'll see that progressive and socialist movements have often taken steps forward during moments of profound disruption and crisis, when people are looking around for other ways to meet their basic needs and organize a society that works for them. And I think there's potential to make those kinds of gains in this crisis as well. At the same time, lots of danger in terms of some of the threats that we face from authoritarianism and right-wing populism and renewed austerity. So whether we win or lose from this crisis depends on how we fight back and how we organize. And I know that Socialist Action does that as their raison d'etre. So I'm going to show a few slides, Elizabeth, to go through my presentation, and hopefully folks can see the cover slide there. The economy after COVID, the need for national reconstruction and planning. I do want to refer you to a couple of written resources that could supplement what I go through in this presentation. 10 Ways the COVID Pandemic Must Change Work for Good. That was a detailed paper that our Centre for Future Work published about the impact on work of the pandemic and how to fix it, how to fix work in the long run. Second article, a shorter one, we're going to need a Marshall Plan to rebuild after COVID-19. Now, I, like you, I'm sure, have mixed feelings about that analogy to the Marshall Plan, given its geopolitical history. But the idea there is one that I'll talk about tonight, which is how do we think about planning as an escape from this crisis? Finally, a more recent article just published this week in Canadian Dimension about the direction of reconstruction after COVID and what the different parties are saying about it in this federal election. So additional reading there. We don't need to take too much time to go over the painful history that we've lived in the last year and a half in terms of the impact of the pandemic on the economy. We had a situation where whole sectors of the economy had to be shut down to protect public health. And that had a spillover impact. If you close a store, then it stops making orders from the wholesaler, and then the wholesaler stops making orders from the manufacturer, and so on and so forth. And you saw a whole disruption in supply chains, international as well as national, big shocks to consumer spending and business investment and exports, and the usual drivers of a capitalist economy. And we quickly went from a situation where you had a kind of a supply shock, shut down in certain industries, to more of a traditional demand side recession where we were being held back by a limited amount of spending. We still haven't rebuilt the quantity of work, and I'll show you data on that. But I also argue that we have to rebuild and improve the quality of work as we come out of the pandemic, in part to address longstanding problems in the way that work was being organized. This shows the course of the downturn in employment in both Canada and the United States. Both, of course, saw a dramatic decline of about 15% in total employment in the first 2 months of the pandemic last year. And in Canada's case, that translates into about 3 million lost jobs. On top of that, there was a lot of people who were technically employed, sometimes just getting income because of the wage subsidy program, not working any or many hours. So the problem was actually deeper than that chart makes it look like. Then both countries started recovering, and neither country has got back to where it was when the pandemic hit. Interesting to note that Canada has done better than the United States, despite all of the complaints that you hear from Canadian business leaders that our government was spending too much money and the CERB was too generous and had destroyed the incentive to work, et cetera, et cetera. Our support programs were stronger than they were in the United States, and yet our employment recovery has been better. So that casts some doubt on that traditional argument. We still hear arguments, from people like Jason Kenney and Doug Ford and Aaron O'Toole that the measures to limit contagion, the lockdowns, the closures of certain industries were too painful for the economy, and that led them to go slow on some of those public health measures, alleging that there's some kind of trade-off between public health and the economy. And that just shows you how even the idea of what the economy is has become reified and divorced from the actual conditions of the vast majority of people who make up the economy. The economy is not a thing in and of itself. The economy is what we refer to as the work that people do to produce goods and services, and then how those goods and services are distributed and used. So you can't have an economy that's healthy if people aren't healthy. And this false trade-off between the economy and public health was a giant self-inflicted wound in our response to COVID. The best thing to do for the economy, clearly, is to keep people healthy and stop the pandemic, and then rebuild. And that means protection, that means income support, and that means a plan to rebuild once we can get back to work. It doesn't mean sacrificing ourselves for the economy. Which actually just means sacrificing ourselves for our employers and the companies and the people who own them. This is a graph that shows there's a rough correlation, in fact, not a perfect one. Obviously, there's lots of different factors that determined how bad COVID was and how many people died from it in different parts of the world. But there's a clear negative relationship between the spread of COVID and the size of the economic downturn that different countries experienced. And in general, the worse was the pandemic, the worse was the hit to the economy. And so this idea that, you can somehow protect the economy by letting the pandemic go, that's an argument we've heard over and over again from people like Jason Kenney, or learn to live with COVID, is nonsense. We have to do everything we can to stop COVID and keep people healthy, and that's the best way to move the economy forward. Canada's experience in this regard was not really out of the ordinary among other industrial countries. The decline in our GDP, which is one way, an imperfect way of measuring the size of the economy last year, about 5.5%, almost exactly equal to the average that was experienced across the OECD. We now have a situation where the labor market has improved a bit, but not enough, and we aren't back to where we need to be. The official unemployment rate as of July was still 7.5%. We'll get the August number tomorrow. It might be a bit lower, but that doesn't tell the whole story. That's really just the tip of the iceberg. To qualify as unemployed, according to the official data in Canada, you have to have not worked a single hour of work, and you have to be actively seeking work. And that's not just watching, the internet and watching the ads. It means putting in several applications, active applications a week. And there's no point doing that if you don't think the work is around. So if you include people who were employed but didn't work, people who have lost their jobs but aren't actively seeking it, or have lost most of their hours but still get a few hours, you get something more in the range of 15% unemployment, which is more like a serious downturn and not just a kind of run-of-the-mill recession. So we're a long ways from being back to our full potential. Economists in kind of conventional discourse have had a debate over what the recovery would look like, and it kind of got boiled down to a very simplistic debate over letters of the alphabet. I know economists can be out to lunch at the best of times, but this was one of the most trivialized debates you can imagine. A V-shaped recovery, which the optimists thought might happen, is where it snaps back as soon as the health restrictions are lifted. That's not going to happen. Others think the snapback will happen, but it might take a little longer. That's the U-shaped recovery. If you're totally pessimistic and you're expecting, the downfall of capitalism imminently, as many socialists have hoped for over the years, then you might see an L-shaped recovery. Some have pointed out the idea of a K-shaped recovery, which means you have two different paths. One group in the economy recovering nicely, another group not recovering at all. And that has a grain of truth in it, but I don't think it quite describes what's happening. Most likely, in my view, is you'll see a partial rebound. We've already seen that, but followed by kind of a imperfect recovery, bouncing along the bottom, a period of long stagnation, unless we have a deliberate effort by government to lead active reconstruction of the whole economy through a reconstruction plan. Now, this would be my kind of picture of it, where you get the initial downturn, a partial rebound. We've already had that, more than half of what was lost, but we're still not back to where we need to get. We're kind of bouncing along unless you get an active government effort to mobilize investment, create jobs, and gain full employment. Problem is, this isn't a letter. So how do I engage in that debate with the other economists about the shape of the recovery? It's not a letter. You could say, if you turn your head sideways, it looks a bit like a corkscrew, maybe, you see? Or somebody suggested on social media that it looked like the Loch Ness Monster. What do you think of that? The Loch Ness Monster recovery, with the monster's head out of the water and then coming back down, and then the tail bouncing along the surface of the water. So I think I'll patent that term, the Loch Ness Monster recovery. As we're trying to recover from the pandemic, we do have a situation where we have to look at the quality of jobs, not just the quantity of jobs, and recognize that the way the pandemic was experienced in Canada reflected these long-term fault lines in our society and in our economy. Those problems were there before COVID, and we knew they were there. But COVID highlighted them and revealed that we were all at risk from things like precarious work. And so if we really want to recover, we have to address those problems as we go forward. And that was the point of that one study that I referred to you at the beginning, 10 ways the pandemic must change work for good, and for good in both senses of the word. That means for better, but also permanently. We have to get this right. And the disequalizing impact of this pandemic is really quite striking and really quite frightening. Every recession is unfair, but this one was brutally and unforgivingly unfair, partly because there was so much inequality in how COVID itself was experienced. We know that it was not equal according to class and race and where you lived, because of poverty and housing conditions and employment. The people who were the most likely to catch COVID at work were the people doing low-wage, insecure jobs in retail and hospitality and meat processing plants and driving taxis and rideshare vehicles. Those are the places you were most exposed, not for the office worker professionals and managers who were able to take their work home and work safely. So that unequal impact of COVID, I think, is an enormous challenge that we have to look at as we're imagining how to get rebuilt from this catastrophe. So our report listed 10 different proposals, 10 different areas where we think the quality of work has to be addressed going forward. I don't have time to go through all 10, but I'll just mention a couple in passing, maybe four. Think of this as, you know, when you go to the pub with a whole bunch of different beers, you can ask for a flight, they call it, right? A flight, and they'll bring you little glasses of 4 different beers. So think of this as a flight of ways that we can change work for good. The first one, we need to give people more space. Secondly, we got to talk about work from home and how to do it fairly. Third, glass in the flight, how do we address precarious work and how that contributed to the pandemic? And then the last one, which kind of links all the others together, is how do workers build their voice and their power in order to demand and win the other changes on that list. So let's quickly go through this sort of flight of ideas, this idea of giving people space. It is interesting to think about, but in general, people who have more power and in their jobs have more space and privacy and in a way, dignity in their jobs. The CEO of a company doesn't get face-to-face with many people at work. They've got a giant corner office. But people who work in a Tim Hortons kitchen or on a meat processing plant or other hard, insecure jobs are generally standing shoulder to shoulder with the other people that they work with. And employers have an interest to compress that space because it allows them to save money on the facility. And a long-term change coming out of this, because this isn't going to be the last pandemic. And even without a pandemic, you've still got issues about contagion and health at work that should be taken more seriously. We have to find ways to give people a bit more space and a bit more privacy in their jobs. So we looked at the type of jobs where people don't have space. You can get data on this and showed that by and large, it involves jobs that are insecure and low paid. So that correlation between space at work and power, spatial relationships at work and power, is another dimension of inequality. And if we think about things like health and safety regulations that require people to have a certain amount of social distancing from their normal within their normal working environment, the people who are going to benefit the most from that are low-income workers. Secondly, there's this whole phenomenon of working from home that sprung up during the pandemic, of course, and there were benefits of that. It allowed a certain section of the workforce, about a third, to keep working and earning money, even when the lockdowns were in place. So that was positive, but lots of risks and downsides, including the inequality of this dimension. Now, by and large, again, not universally, but by and large, people who could work from home are people who have professional designations, higher education, higher income, and more secure jobs to start with. So that seems like a double inequality. The people who were able to keep working in a way were the ones who were best able to absorb a loss in their income if they hadn't been able to work from home. Whereas the people who couldn't work from home are the ones who were least able to afford a disruption in their income. The number of Canadians working from home tripled in the first couple of months of the pandemic to about 5 million, and it has hardly fallen since then. Last month, July 2021, there were 4.8 million Canadians working mostly from home. And so I think there will be some erosion of that as the pandemic finally ends, whenever it finally ends. But I think there will be some permanent increase in the amount of work from home that occurs. And there's a number of issues that are going to be raised in terms of how do we make sure that's a fair, sustainable, and safe way to earn a living. And there's lots of ways in which employers are going to try and take advantage of the work from home phenomenon to extend the workday, to require that workers stay available outside of regular working hours, and to even cut their pay. We've seen companies like Google say, yeah, you can work from home, but we're going to pay you 15% less because you don't have to commute anymore. And if people are desperate, they'll accept that offer if they don't have a union to negotiate on their behalf. So lots of ways in which the level of exploitation could get worse under a work from home environment. The third glass in this flight of beers that I'm presenting you is the whole issue of precarious work, which is very strongly correlated with the harm that the pandemic did. We knew all about precarious work before the pandemic hit, but COVID showed how dangerous it is, not just to people in those jobs, but to public health as a whole. So problems like multiple job holding, where people who have precarious jobs often try to put 2 or 3 or even 4 jobs together to support themselves. All that means is that if you get sick, you're going to carry the virus to 2 or 3 or 4 different workplaces. And if your workplace is a long-term care facility, that's going to kill people. Another issue is the fact that people in these jobs generally don't have paid sick leave, which means they have an immediate financial penalty if they do the right thing by staying home if they're sick or if they've been exposed to COVID somewhere. So these are ways in which fixing precarious work is absolutely essential. Again, not just for people in those jobs, but for their customers, for their clients, for their colleagues, and for public health in general. The differential impact of the initial layoffs on workers in precarious jobs, just stunning, overwhelming evidence that people in precarious jobs were much more at risk from the initial downturns. That initial decline in employment was 15%. It was twice as bad if you were in a part-time job. It was twice as bad if you were in a temporary job. And go figure, that shouldn't be a surprise. That's why employers do this. Employers go for precarious work arrangements precisely because they want to be able to dump their labor off the minute that it isn't needed. And that's exactly what we saw happening. Private sector workers were much more vulnerable than people in the public sector to layoffs. Here's an interesting one. If you don't have a union, you were more than twice as likely to be laid off in the pandemic if you do. And this highlights, in a painful way, it highlights one of the most important benefits of being in a union, which is a bit of job security. You can't just be thrown out the door or not have a contract renewed. The employer has to go through a set of steps, including notice, severance pay, seniority, and so on, before people can lose their jobs. The last point on our list was if we're going to win any of those other changes, including more space and safer working conditions and limits on precarious work and fair practices on working from home, none of those are going to get fixed if workers don't have voice and get organized and have power. And that's true at the workplace level, and it's true, obviously, at the social level. And we've had, I think, some successes in Canada compared to other countries in terms of the strength and staying power of our union movement, but lots of attacks and limitations as well. And we've done some other work through our Center for Future Work on the importance of worker voice, being able to have a collective voice to express demands in the workplace, to protect themselves, and to win change. And I think the COVID pandemic has shown dramatically why workers have to be organized to protect themselves and win back a better future. Let me take the last few minutes and talk about what comes next in terms of how we fully recover from this Loch Ness monster recovery and the role of economic planning in making that happen. We're in yet another wave of COVID now, the fourth wave. The variants are obviously a different order of magnitude of risk. So even though we've got vaccines rolling out fairly well, but not well enough, we're still not out of this. And we're going to face restrictions and illness and sadly death. And we're also going to have economic consequences because we aren't going to get back to business as normal, whatever that is. That's not what we wanted anyways, while thousands of people are still contracting COVID and hundreds of people are in ICUs with it. All kinds of uncertainty is going to hold back that economy. It isn't going to fix itself. Capitalism never fixes itself. And we have a situation where the normal drivers of a capitalist economy, business investment and exports, are going to be too damaged to get us back to where we need to be. And this is where we need a plan. This is where we need state planning and public sector leadership to lead that long-term reconstruction. All kinds of things that we need to invest in, including a health system, infrastructure, the climate transition, of course, housing that people can actually afford, permanent expansion of public services, and industrial development strategy to make sure that Canada has got the industries that we need including an industry to make vaccines and other health supplies. The overarching goal of the plan is to put Canadians to work to the fullest extent possible, producing the goods and services that can lift our standard of living and enhance environmental conditions. And that can absolutely happen, but it won't happen by itself. There's a bit of an analogy, an imperfect analogy, I certainly acknowledge, but a bit of an analogy to what happened at the end of World War II, when we had the expansion of government economic planning during the war to mobilize that incredible war effort. But then even at the end of the war, we had a Minister of Reconstruction, who at that time was C.D. Howe, who had led much of the work around economic planning during the war, talked about and implemented a strategy for continued economic planning and public investment and infrastructure after the war ended, including building good industries like aerospace and the auto industry, and building Canada-wide infrastructure like the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Trans-Canada Highway, and expanding our social infrastructure with healthcare and public pensions and unemployment insurance. And so there's needs that have to be met, and there are idle resources that can be put to work to meet them. I've just shown you that there's 3 million Canadians, 15% of the labor force, who are unemployed or underutilized. 3 million Canadians can produce a lot of housing and a lot of social care and a lot of infrastructure. Matching those two things, the unused labor with the unmet needs, should be a no-brainer, but it's a no-brainer that requires a plan. We've done some work through our center on the value of early childhood education and the proposal for a universal early childhood system, which obviously is at risk now, depending on who wins this election. And we've shown what a gigantic economic boost that kind of a program would be in terms of 200,000 jobs created in early childhood education centers, but lots of other jobs created by the support for women's full labor market participation, and new goods and services produced, and new government revenue generated from that production. In fact, we showed that early childhood education pays for itself if you create the jobs that those people can fill. I just have to wave my arms for a moment because I've got very energy efficient lights in my office that just went off. Just hold on. There. Now, of course, the people, the forces, the powers that be hate the idea of government spending more money on childcare or anything else, and they're banging the drums about the risk of public debt and austerity and everything else. And this is absolutely a charade. The issue is not whether we have money to pay for stuff. Money is never the limit on what we can do. Our brains and our brawn is the only limit on what we can do. If we can do something, we can pay for it. Is the motto, and particularly because interest rates are so low, and we have seen that we can use the Bank of Canada and the whole credit system to support public spending, including on infrastructure and public services, in a way the genie is out of the bottle because of how the government and the Bank of Canada responded to this crisis. And we've shown that the deficit is not a limit on what we can do. And we shouldn't let the right-wingers put the genie back in the bottle and start the whole debt hysteria as well. So just to conclude, and I thank you all for your attention, this has been an incredibly painful and destructive and harmful bit of our history, most of all, of course, for the families who lost loved ones and those who are still fighting the effects of catching COVID. And there's all kinds of dangers at hand, watching those horrible demonstrations of the so-called populists. I don't accept that term for them. There's something worse than that. Outside the hospitals last week, we know that there are dangers out there and that we have to present a positive alternative that captures the energy and the frustration that people are feeling. There is an opportunity as well. I do think that people's mindset has been shifted by the pandemic. An opportunity to recognize the value of all jobs, to remember the importance of the state and public services and infrastructure in leading our development and protecting us, and imagining a whole different model of economic progress, one that's based on meeting human needs instead of private profit. And we could think about somehow about coming out of this. If we make those demands effectively and organize for them, we could, I think, come out better from this terrible chapter of our history. So with that, I will thank you for your attention, and I look forward to Flo's comments and the discussion that comes afterwards. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Yes, our next discussant, of course, is Florence Shade, and she is a leading member of SA based in Wet'suwet'en territory near a place called Burns Lake in British Columbia. She has a keen interest in history, philosophy, social movement, and economics, accumulating in a master's degree in religion and science in the from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. She is currently enjoying developing her own political consciousness through literature, discussion, and organization skills. Welcome, Flo.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Jim. Love that presentation. Love a good PowerPoint. So I wanted to start by saying that I've read a few of your other articles online, and I appreciate that it seems you recognize, modern monetary theory and its austerity fighting policy implications for a currency issuing government. And I fully agree that we have to engage full throttle to provide the necessities of life during this acute crisis. However, that said, a more functional and technical understanding of money alone doesn't necessarily provide for these necessities. And this is evinced, in my opinion, by the decades of quantitative easing that have occurred in the US and is happening in Canada now, which has almost solely benefited the corporate banking, real estate, and speculation sectors. The fundamental structures which dictate how money enters the economy, such as bonds or reserves, and what distribution of the population holds that government debt, the masses or the 1%, are also important factors in realizing the transformative potential of this new understanding. What I'm getting at is it's imperative to examine the fundamental dynamics within our political economy, which lead capital to flow upwards and accumulate there, bypassing the working class along the way and serving only to fortify the status quo. Thus, I feel that any discussion about changing neoclassical economic theory tends to invite the topic of political system change along with it. Massive public investment is a beneficial and necessary starting place, in my opinion. But even large-scale public investment projects must keep an eye towards closing off the link between government and private business if they seek to create improvements for the lives of the working class. With this in mind, I would propose, in addition to Jim's calls for more effort public investment, given the crises before us and the potential utility of MMT, we could formulate transitional demands towards a workers' government for 1, civil guarantees, and 2, sector nationalizations or expropriations. We need a job guarantee or an income guarantee, a housing guarantee, and a full spectrum healthcare guarantee. This is similar to, but also very different from a certain percentage of public investment in a sector, because by guaranteeing to fill the spaces previously occupied by private capital with a high quality public option, not only does the risk of destitution and death related to unemployment and homelessness in a capitalist society nearly eliminate, but it would also have the effect of allowing the government to become the market maker, the market leader in these critical areas of supporting the basics of life. It would force private capital to compete with the government standard, which should be pegged theoretically to the public interest and shared values around living standards and human dignity. Introducing these guarantees, along with public services and the nationalization of key industries which impact the public, such as telecom, education, and energy, would cut the legs out from these markets and take a big step towards a more centrally planned, needs-based economy. However, while this would be a transformative change for the most downtrodden among us, leaving the option open for wealth to pool in private enterprise would eventually lead to the same degradation of worker and human rights, as powerful interests would find ways to corrupt and shape the government. Why do I think this? Well, because it does this now already, because it has done this in the past after similar full throttle efforts in the 30s and 50s. it must be said, without fundamentally changing the nature of the state towards a truly democratic and representative one via a revolutionary socialist program, solutions to the crises caused by capitalism that rely on a bourgeois state to sustain and cultivate them are doomed to be met with internal contradiction. Now, it's not to say that the sequence of progress shouldn't first begin with large-scale investments and rights guarantees, because I do think this kind of public participation initiative could actually help generate the political consciousness that would be fruitful to discuss the critical importance for the next step of radically transforming representative democracy via a workers' government. One of the most critical ways to ensure that a government remains committed to looking after the best interests of the working class and not the capitalist class is to ensure that all productive enterprises are publicly owned and operated, or otherwise that everyone is a public sector worker. Now, whether publicly in this case looks like one nationalized central authority making every micromanagement decision, or whether there is involved some democratic feedback protocol built into the political structure is one of the areas that the left loves the most to fight about. But I digress. The point is that leaving any opportunity for capital to accumulate in the hands of a few will result in the eventual resurgence of the owner class power because of the self-interested and self-buttressing nature of economic power within a capitalist political state. History has revealed that so far, every opportunity to dismantle socialist won progress from within the state itself has been utilized by the bourgeoisie. That the revolutionary socialist movements are targeted, sabotaged, and prevented from generating the escape velocity capable of overcoming the political gains of a socially democratic program. Exactly because the bourgeois state has at its disposal the full power of the armed forces and intelligentsia to manipulate, intimidate, propagandize, infiltrate, throw in jail, and all the rest. Through the military, industrial, financial, media, what have you complex, the modern capitalist nation state has built itself quite the convenient, insular, and self-supporting network of political economy. This must be recognized and reckoned with if lasting progress is to be made. In closing, I think there are some very interesting areas to explore between the insights of MMT and the opportunity to use post-COVID recovery to delineate specific transitional demands that could help create the right conditions for a revolutionary surge to the end of exploitation of labor once and for all via a worker-controlled government. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Flo. Thank you so much. Now we're going to turn it back over to our technical producer, Kurt, and he will hear some questions from our online audience. We will take 3 or 4 questions at a time and then call on our panelists to respond to 1 or more questions. It's up to them. So Kurt, it's over to you to put the questions in the chat. And this time we will start with Jim and then Flo, and you have up to 5 minutes each to answer 1, 2, or 3 questions. Kurt, over to you.
Okay, 1 second. All right, so our first question is, some big businesses achieved huge profits, reaped unprecedented wealth during the first year of the pandemic. Liberals take credit for big spending, but much of it went into the pockets of the rich. So I guess he wants an elaboration on that. The next question is, there have been many people who took the shutdown as an opportunity to increase their skills and demand better and higher paying jobs. Do you see this trend continuing? And our final question is, should we expect to see the most severe austerity ever implemented following the pandemic? What can labor unions do now to prepare themselves? You're muted.
Sorry, you see, I knew I would be the first one to do it. Okay, so Jim, it's up to you. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Kurt, for the questions. By the way, this is a great system you've got with this live stream from my point of view as a speaker, where I can see the questions instead of trying to remember the 3 in a row. So well done, Kurt, and your team for the technical planning on this. The issue of profits, this is a really interesting one because I think this is the first recession in history where profits actually went up because of the business's capacity to kind of siphon off a very rich share of all of the government support programs that were handed out. That was most direct with that wage subsidy. There was a program called the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, or CEWS, that was paid directly to business on condition that they were supposed to maintain employment in their firms. But even indirectly, just through the extra spending power that was created by the government support, businesses did much better than we expected. Now, it's important to note that personal incomes went up during this recession as well. It would be the first recession in history where family incomes went up, because it turned out that the income that came from the CERB and the other emergency supports was actually greater than the amount of income lost through unemployment. Now, there's some conservatives who say that's proof that the government was spending willy-nilly and just wasting lots of money. I don't accept that. In fact, one of the reasons that unemployment wasn't worse is precisely because that income was distributed quite quickly and quite effectively. All that's to say that, yes, business looked after its own interests very well. You're quite right, Barry. And the answer for that, in my view, is not that we shouldn't have done this, but number one, we could have had, I think, some tighter conditions and controls on it. But even more important, given that, it was very urgent that we got that income support out quickly. And I wouldn't have held it up, to try and get extra checks and balances on it. I think more importantly is that they pay their share now, and this is where we need corporate tax reform and a wealth tax to make sure that people who have profited so nicely during this horrible pandemic actually give back to help fund the recovery. Kurt's question about the training, lots of interest in retraining, and there will be some permanent structural changes in the economy because of the pandemic. There's no doubt about that. Some of the industries are going to be permanently smaller after the pandemic. At the same time, there's other industries that will see opportunities. I'm always just a little bit cautious about how much emphasis to put on training as part of the solution. Because of course, it's not just a matter of getting the right skills. You've got to have a decent job at the end of it that uses the right skills. So I do think that, first of all, Canadians are very well skilled and very well educated. Canadians, by some measures, are the best educated workforce in the world. A higher proportion of the working age population has higher education, including vocational education, college and universities, than any other OECD country. And it's good to get more skills, absolutely. But that always has to be paired with a plan to create high quality jobs that use those skills. Last question from Julius: should we expect austerity? It's certainly a risk, and we will see calls for austerity. We see it from, obviously, Erin O'Toole in this election campaign, and even more dramatically from Maxime Bernier. I kind of think of them as yin and yang. They aren't really rivals. Bernier is the bad cop, and he serves to help make O'Toole look more reasonable. But they would both sacrifice all kinds of essential services and programs to pursue the balanced budget. And it isn't the balanced budget they care about. They honestly don't give a shit about the balanced budget. What they really care about is reinforcing a traditional neoliberal world in which the state can't do these things. And if we let them head in that direction, then we will face austerity. It isn't inevitable, though. So, I accept Flo's points that modern monetary theory, I'm not an advocate of modern monetary theory, but there's some of the insights that I argue for that are similar to what they've argued for. That alone doesn't solve anything. We have to have the organized power to make demands about the priorities we want to see in the reconstruction after COVID. And if we have the power to make those demands, we can absolutely afford it. So whether austerity occurs or not depends all on who wins the battle that's ahead of us.
Thanks, Jim. Flo?
Sure. I'm not sure if I have too much to add, other than just kind of reiterating that a deficit, kind of as Jim was saying, and we've been talking about itself, I don't think even really means that much. It's more important to me, I think, to look at where the money's going and how it's getting there, and what's happening to it along the way, and whether it's going to something productive or whether it's just going, to asset price inflation. And I think it's kind of like ironic in a way, that as far as I like understand it, and I have just an interested layperson's, let's say, understanding of things, but the thing that can or would temper inflation the most would be spending money into like productive forces of the economy rather than just increasing the prices of assets like real estate and securities and whatnot. But that's not what has been done so far. Like, so far, they've been pumping a bunch of money into banks and corporations who don't build factories and don't hire people. And it's kind of, I think, as long as we kind of stick to this neoclassical or neoliberal trickle down model, then it's going to always be that way. So I think that is kind of where we need to hone in our focus. And and in terms of the austerity too, what's going to happen, there is a risk, but I kind of feel like in some ways that ship has sailed in a way. I feel like a lot of people are recognizing that a deficit can serve different interests, and it's kind of up to us now to determine what those interests and who the people and the classes are that it should serve.
Okay, thank you, Flo. Okay, so it's back to our producer now for 3 more questions. Kurt? Hello, Kurt?
Sorry, I asked for a moment, but
That's okay.
was muted. So, okay. So, first question is, how do we use this time to push for unionization among non-unionized workers? Second question is, instead of a wage subsidy to big employers, should we aim to take control of major industries? Is there any other way to affect Reconstruction and democratic planning that is mindful of the environment? And our final question is, there is a US data indicating 1/3 of workers are now gig workers. Is there Canadian data indicating this trend? Does Canada have a greater or lower proportion of workers in the gig economy?
Thanks, Kurt. Okay, like before, you each have up to 5 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3 questions, or none. And we're going to start with Flo, and then Jim.
Okay. I guess I'll just address the first question. I think, I don't know, but it's kind of like such a good question because I think now is it's a perfect time to do more union drives. And I've kind of hinted at this before, but I haven't done all the sort of research and legwork, and maybe Jim can comment on this more, but just expanding unionization and labor representation, and how, given current, I guess, labor legislation, like how can we include more new sectors or, service sectors, non-trades or non-traditionally unionized sectors? How do we start them? What's the obstacles to starting, a union from scratch, and how do we kind of support those efforts? I think these are all really good questions. And as I've said before, I think now is the time to also just think creatively about how we can organize as labor in a community form, a trade union. I think we should, instead of thinking about what's been done before, we should think about the limits and that are in front of us and kind of work backwards from that.
Okay, thank you. Jim?
Thank you. Yeah, I agree fully with Flo on that. The need to think outside the box in terms of how we organize workers and how we build a fit for purpose union movement that reflects the the challenges and conditions of this moment in history. I do think back again to the, I said earlier, sometimes big things come out of crises. I think back to the 1930s and how that did spark a real rethinking on the part of union organizers in North America. That's when the CIO was formed, and industrial unionism was born, and a whole new kind of generation of more creative and militant union organizers was launched. And of course, a lot of water under the bridge since then, but I think, need something like that kind of revisioning and re-energizing of union organizing. Interesting point, union density in Canada went up during the pandemic. Now that's for good reasons and for bad reasons. The good reasons are that we did see some organizing in different places. Healthcare sector, a lot of new organizing, some in retail and hospitality. You've probably heard about the Indigo stores and a couple of Starbucks. Airlines, in the last year, WestJet, once one of the leading anti-union companies in the country, now mostly union. So there are some gains on that score. But the main reason unionization went up was that thing I pointed out in my presentation, which is you were much more likely to lose your job if you were not in a union. And again, that's very painful for people who lost their job. On the other hand, it does, I think, affirm one of the most important benefits of a union. So I'm struck, I do a lot of international work, and I am struck by the relative stability of union density and union power in Canada. And there are some interesting reasons to explore for that, but it is something on our side here. So let's make the most of it. The second question there about wage subsidy to big employers, obviously it's just an inherently limited strategy. You're giving money to the bosses and saying, gee, I hope you'll keep people working. And that's not enough. Maybe in a short-term emergency situation, it did help to preserve jobs and keep people getting paid. It also helped to preserve ties between workplaces and workers. So it was easier to reopen when that became possible. So I think those were all good things, but as a strategy for reconstruction, it's not nearly enough. And we are going to have to think about ways that we can have the capacity to plan, and some that is going to involve, in some places, public ownership. I believe in public ownership, not just as a kind of slogan or nostalgia. I think there are clear cases where public ownership makes sense, and we're starting to see some of the arguments for that come up around the campaigns for re-municipalization of things like basic utilities and water and electricity, where it's been privatized. Things like airlines, where it just doesn't make sense to have them privately owned, and other transportation infrastructure, and other, I think, key places where you can make a strong, modern, qualitative argument that public ownership works better. And I do think there are going to be some opportunities for us to fight and win some of those battles. The last question was about gig workers. The person refers to US data indicating a third of workers are gig workers. That sounds very high to me. In my research, we've done a lot of research on gig work. We would find between 5 and 10% of total employment gig workers of various kinds, not just Uber and rideshare and food delivery, but other very informal, sometimes digitally mediated ways to work. Part of the problem too is it's not new. There's nothing new about that way of hiring people. Uber pretends that they're innovative and on the cutting edge, but they're just doing something that bosses have done for centuries, which is hire people when they want them and get rid of them when they don't. So the old gang master system, or the putting out system in the Industrial Revolution, or other arrangements like that, which were convenient for the boss, but very precarious and exploitive for the workers. This is just a digital reincarnation of those old models. And we do see, less digitally mediated forms of that, exactly that happening. Think about cleaners, who are often constituted as independent contractors to clean an office building. And that way, the employer doesn't have to pay the minimum wage. So there's the gig phenomenon is part of the bigger shift towards precarious work, which has all kinds of consequences, including, as we talked about, public health. And I think we've got opportunities to, first of all, show that those people are workers. They are not, their own independent little businesses. That's just nonsense. And secondly, think about ways that they can be extended the same basic protections and benefits as any other worker should be allowed.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So now we're going to go back to our producer for our final questions. And this time we have 4. So I will give each panelist up to 7 minutes to answer 1, 2, 3, or 4 questions. And this time we will start with Jim and then Flo. So over to you, Kurt.
Okay. First question is there new data on increased technology-based surveillance of workers at home and their place of employment in Canada? Have seen an anecdotal reports, but not a lot of data. Next question is, the food packing industry is notorious for the deplorable working conditions. What methods can we use to apply pressure in order to bring about the changes you propose, and that's specifically to Jim, to their working condition? Next question is, are there any signs that the parties will put money into infrastructure after the election? And our next question is, Jagmeet Singh proposes a 1% tax on the wealth of the uber rich, but what would it take actually to fund national child care, pharmacare, unlimited paid sick leave, free post-secondary education, green energy? And add on to that question is, what is your take on the leaders' election platforms and the recent debates, and any prognosis for tonight's debate?
Okay, so we're going to go to Jim, and you have 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth and Kurt. That's a great range of questions. Wow. First of all, is there data on technology-based surveillance of workers? Yes. And yes, it is a problem. I think this is the dirty underbelly of the digital economy that hasn't had enough attention given to it. Our Centre for Future Work, our Australian office, I do work in both Australia and Canada. This was one of our Australian reports, looked at digital surveillance of workers and what is happening. This was before COVID. So our main emphasis was not on work from home. It was on all the different types of digital surveillance that are out there. Including, many times in a job, your ID card has a GPS chip in it, so the boss can follow you around in real time and figure out exactly where you are and how long you stopped for coffee and how long you spent in the bathroom. Just absolutely offensive. Things like closed circuit TV everywhere. Things like digital performance monitoring, keystroke counting, or at a cashier, how fast you're checking the groceries. And apart from the damage that's done to dignity and privacy, there's obviously health and safety implications of this, both physical health and mental health, from being under that sort of stress and scrutiny all the time. I also think there's macroeconomic implications of digital surveillance. Think about how bosses have always, in the history of wage labor, had to balance out the carrot and the stick, if you like, the positive incentive and inducement to stay on the job and stay engaged and perform well, versus the negative punishment up to and including dismissal if you don't meet the boss's expectations. And employers have always used both of them in varying combinations. But if the stick becomes very cheap and very effective, in the sense that you can have digital performance, you don't have to hire supervisors to look over your shoulder. The camera, the webcam does it, including for homework, when this digital surveillance system is going to follow you home, which is all the more worrisome. Then the boss feels less pressure to pay you a carrot. And I think it is part of the reason for wage stagnation that we've seen in many countries. So this is a big problem, and it doesn't get enough attention. And I'd like to see it get more attention from economists, and I'd like to see it get more attention in the union movement, and I'd like to see it get more attention in politics. Second question was about the food packing industry and their working conditions. Food packing, meat packing in particular, was a hotbed of COVID infection for obvious reasons. You've got hundreds of people standing shoulder to shoulder for hours at a time doing this dangerous and demanding work. And it's just a horrible case study of how the employer's interest in minimizing the cost of the facility, including by minimizing the space for people to do their jobs, translates into illness and death. So, the biggest COVID infections we had in Canada were in places like the meatpacking plant, the Cargill meatpacking plant in Alberta, and other plants like it. So what is it going to take? It's going to take advocacy and activism and organizing and pressure, up to and including, I would think, work stoppages. I know that it was tough going in the pandemic, but we knew those places were dangerous, and some of them are unionized. So, a no-brainer at that stage to try and get Jason Kenney to take the Cargill situation seriously would have been to stop work. But for whatever reason, our brothers and sisters there didn't feel they had the power to do that, but they should. And this is going to be the way that we win those improvements in those workplaces and other ones that are equally vulnerable. Third question, are there signs that the parties will put money into infrastructure after the election? Yes, there are signs. In fact, they're already doing it. Public infrastructure capital spending has been a source of the economic recovery. And, some of those projects are really important and really beneficial, including obviously public transit that we've seen a big upsurge in investment in, not enough yet. Of course, there's always a temptation from the neoliberal parties to want to privatize that infrastructure. So that's something to watch for and fight against. But infrastructure itself, I think we're winning the debate that it has to be an important part of rebuilding, not just for the short-term stimulus to jobs and incomes, but the long-term benefit to quality of life from high quality public infrastructure and public capital and social infrastructure. We shouldn't just think of it as roads and bridges and sewers. We should also think of infrastructure as the capacity for us to care for each other through public and human and caring services. The fourth question, Jagmeet Singh's proposed wealth tax. The wealth tax has gotten a fair amount of interest as a measure to oppose inequality. Personally, I mean, obviously I support it. I'm cognizant that we aren't going to solve the problem by letting these bastards get so rich in the first place and then taking away a bit of their wealth through a redistributive tax. Part of it has to be a redistribution or a pre-distribution, not a redistribution. We need to have measures in place that stop these people from getting so rich in the first place. And that means limits on their profitability. That means paying workers better. That means limiting their monopoly powers, which companies like Amazon and Google have used to make so much money. So I think a wealth tax can be part of the solution, but it isn't the whole solution. And I also think we have to be careful in some of the ways that this has been proposed as a way of paying for recovery. I disagree that we need a wealth tax to pay for recovery. I've been arguing we don't need taxes. The idea for new taxes is not to pay for recovery. The idea for new taxes is to make society fairer. And we've already seen that we can pay for anything we need to do in terms of the ability of government and the Bank of Canada to mobilize resources. So I have, with some caveats, a lot of sympathy for the wealth tax idea. Last question was about the federal leaders' election platforms and the recent debates they've had and a prognosis for tonight's debate, which begins in 1 hour. I'm going to be live tweeting the debate, actually, from our Center for Future Work. I'll be following in particular any of the debate around work and employment issues and trying to counter some of the myths out there about jobs and incomes and wages. So I'll be interested to see. There's a whole, every election ends up being about parties and leaders. Obviously, that's what an election is. But I'm always keen to look at what are the ideas underlining all that, rather than saying, rah, rah, rah for one particular party or another. I'm looking at how the ideas have shifted and changed. And that was the point of that article I mentioned at the beginning that I have in Canadian Dimension this week about the way that economic and monetary policy and social policy changed and shifted during the pandemic, the windows that opened because of those shifts, and what can we as progressives and socialists do to keep those opportunities alive. And none of the parties, as all of you know, none of the parties has a perfect platform, but there's clearly ways in which we've moved the dial on some of the key issues, and I'd like to see us keeping that dial moving. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Flo?
Okay, Jim answered those very thoroughly. Thanks, Jim. And I totally agree right there with you on the taxes paying for things. And I think we should get rid of taxpayer money and just start calling it public money. And that, I like that term, pre-distributive, and through reforming the tax code, absolutely. I think it's interesting too. I just wanted to comment. I guess it reminded me of some experiences I've had, and to kind of just illustrate the point I was sort of talking about these. There is a tension or a contradiction, I think, between the idea of public ownership on the one hand, and then the meaning of the government, and whether it is representative and for the people, or who the government as a public body or an agency is serving through the policies and the processes and all the structures that they implement. So with Jagmeet Singh proposing a 1% wealth tax, hey, sure, that's great. Would it cover everything? My understanding is that it's not even close in terms of the national child care, pharmacare, unpaid sick leave. Surely it wouldn't cover a federal job guarantee. And but on the one hand, so he wants to tax the wealthy to ostensibly pay for these programs. It is kind of wanting to have it both ways a little bit, because I've worked for, public institutions. Social services was the last place I was at in a sort of management position. And it was publicly funded. It was government funded by the province, but it was also an austerity driven government. I mean, it's an NDP government. And so when you have these two things together, it's actually a real challenge to pull together the funding and the resources for that infrastructure. That infrastructure isn't there. And you're essentially completely dependent now on austerity politics and a government body that doesn't want to fund you, or basically views the whole sector as a opportunity to make cuts and balance the budget, right? So I think if you want to go for these bold policies, you really have to ditch the austerity politics and go full all the way there, because otherwise you're going to be kind of enacting this strange self-starvation scenario, and it's just not necessary. And again, it's off the backs of the workers, as everything tends to flow upwards. It doesn't trickle down, it just flows up, right? Because I'll just end with this, but interestingly enough, in a kind of situation like that, ironically, private enterprises, which were in the market as well, so there's public option, but because the public option was so underfunded relative to the private option, and you can see this in a lot of other sectors as well, health, education, you name it. The private sector got most of the contracts for social services. I'm talking about supported living, assisted living, people with disabilities, people health, taking care of one another, right? They generated their own revenue. They would get, and this allowed them to leverage more, and it just kind of snowballed into the private option having all of the resources, all of the power, all of the leverage, and then the public option essentially being starved. So I just want to kind of just refocus on that we need to examine the relationships between all of the different variables in the economy as well, to kind of determine whether it fits together well, right? And that is where I will leave it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Flo. So we have 2 or 3 minutes left. So if one of you, both of you, want to say something that maybe you've forgotten that you would like to say, you have 2 or 3 minutes each to do it. So I'll go to you first, Flo. Do you have any last words that you might want to say?
Oh, gee, I think I pretty much said it all there on my little tangent. Other than that, it was super fun speaking with you, Jim, and I've just enjoyed this opportunity.
Okay, so what about you, Jim? You have to take 2 or 3 minutes if you want to do a wrap up or something you might have wanted to say. just didn't get the time?
Well, mostly, Elizabeth, thank you and your comrades in Socialist Action for what you're doing and pulling this session together, and your other education and organizing work. It makes an important contribution to our overall progressive movement in Canada. Flo, very nice to meet you digitally, and since we're both on the same side of the country, I'd love to follow up on some of these discussions. You're bang on in terms of your vision of what has to happen for an accountable, democratic, inclusive economy. So I look forward to carrying on the discussion. Fingers crossed we don't get O'Toole at the end of this election, and more importantly, that we get further progress in terms of the battle of ideas that I think underpins all of these debates. So thanks for all that you're doing and for your interest tonight.
Well, thanks to you, Jim. Thanks very much, and to Flo, and of course to Kurt, our producer in Mississauga. So please consider being a supporter, all of you listeners out there, to Socialist Action newspaper, which will be sent to you online. To fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. If you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com, or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. And once again, folks, if you like this show, please subscribe to this Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next essay webcast will be on Thursday, September the 16th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, on the topic Trotsky, Krupskaya, and the Bolshevik Tradition, featuring Paul LeBlanc, historian at La Roche University in Pittsburgh, a labor and socialist activist who has written or edited more than 30 books on topics such as Leon Trotsky, and also we will have discussing John Riddell, who is a historian, editor, translator, activist, and editor of the Communist International in Lenin's time, and an 8-volume series of books on the Communist International. So, fellow listeners, in the meantime, please be safe, stay healthy, stay active. Bye for now.